Proposal. Theatrical short subject. On March 9, 1967, filmmaker William Greaves put pen to paper to propose what he termed a theatrical short subject. The short film he envisaged would soon become the groundbreaking feature SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM, Take One.
Basic concept. There is a tremendous unstated need on the part of audiences for a new cinematic language, one in which a more total statement of reality can be made.
A language which, on one hand, brings the viewer more intimately into the inner mental operations of the creative cinema artist, while at the same time illuminates the inner operations of the human psyche as it struggles with the basic human problems of social existence.
A language whose intimacy catapults the viewer into a state of consciousness that broadens his perceptions and perspectives of social issues, which are fiercely rocking the boat of what could become a great society.
A language whose essence of sheer theatricality is created out of the fresh and innovative use of camera, director, actor, and script.
It is this sort of cinema language which I would like to apply to this theatrical short, as opposed to the more conventional documentary or travelogue approach currently in use.
My film will be simultaneously cinema verite, documentary, avant-garde, dramatic. Let me explain.
The documentary aspect of my short shows how a film crew, actors, and a director go about the business of shooting a film on location, of penetrating human character, of applying the laws of aesthetics to the motion picture image and sound.
The dramatic aspect of the film will be found not only in the themes of marital strife, homosexuality, and social responsibility, which form the basis of the dramatic story being filmed, but also there will be drama in the struggles which take place on the part of the actors, the director, and the crew to heighten the reality and dramatic intensity of their work.
The cinema verite aspect guarantees a spontaneity in the shooting, with its candid camera grasp of the before the lens, behind the lens drama. Audience response to this kind of filmmaking is highly simpatico.
The avant-garde aspect, which will include not only the synthesis of documentary, dramatic, and cinema verite, but also the extensive use of improvisation technique in the work of the actors and the director. Extensive use by the director cameraman and the cameraman of the close-up and of the extreme close-up. The several levels of reality which will simultaneously and theatrically bombard the viewer. A Negro director whose unique presence gives an added social dimension to the film as he and his crew simultaneously break into the dramatic action as they pursue their work. And finally, the whole undertaking should have the flavor of a happening, cinema style.
The story, take one, take two. An avant-garde film crew arrives on a location in Central Park with two actors who play the roles of man and wife.
They are to shoot a screen test of the two performers.
They began to film the crisis climax scene of the feature film to be produced.
The actors, director, cameraman, become unhappy with the limitations of the script. They feel it does not express the true nature of the characters' relationship with each other.
They decide to improvise the basic situation, which begins with the pursuit of the wife in Central Park by the husband.
He is unable to get her to talk to him.
Eventually, we learn that she has discovered that despite their marriage, her husband has not given up his homosexual escapades. Just this Sunday morning, he has gone so far as to flirt with a young man in church.
To her, it is painfully clear that he is not a man, and despite his protestations that his homosexuality is a thing of the past, he's very involved with it.
She upbraids him for having shirked the responsibilities of a husband, father, and citizen of a troubled society.
He avoids having children, runs away from any kind of community involvement.
To her mind, he lacks guts and courage.
She is hurt, enraged, and disgusted with him. And as far as she is concerned, their marriage is over.
The husband tries to elicit compassion and understanding from his wife.
He tries to get her to see how hard he's trying to make the marriage work, that he did not feel that they were ready for children, that he cannot be crucified because he has not changed overnight, that he's trying to change, that he needs her help, her empathy.
He realizes that her inability to empathize, to feel for him in his struggle with his problem, is part of a larger problem that she herself has had in their marriage, which is the inability to give of herself, to feel anything when they make love and in the other ways in which they relate to each other. That in fact, she is sitting on top of her feelings, that she is afraid to have feelings, particularly about sex, that she is cold and frigid and does not help him to elicit his manhood.
He goes on to confront her with her fears of becoming emotionally involved.
He observes that she doesn't mind being involved in civic affairs and other activities outside of their home, but not with him. He muses that perhaps that this is the reason that she married him in the first place, knowing about his homosexuality, knowing that in these circumstances, she would never be asked to be a woman.
He then goes on to accuse her of being homosexual herself, latent, but homosexual nonetheless.
At least he has had the courage to admit his homosexuality, to try to deal with it.
Where is her courage, he asks.
He mentions all the incriminating evidence that suggests latent homosexuality in his wife. Her competitiveness, her assumption of male roles in their everyday life, her tenderness towards her girlfriends, and so forth.
His confrontation of his wife with these and other observations are traumatic for her.
She screams. She slaps him and begins to cry. And then what ensues is a poignant scene in which she admits her inability to give of herself, her fear of her own emotions and where they might lead her.
She asks his help, and he asks her for her help and understanding.
They leave the park. Two
weak people
who are
getting
getting
stronger.
stronger. Final thought. The entire story is foolproof from the point of theatricality, in that should the actors fail in their performances, the director and the actors struggle for high quality performances will become the real drama. And there is always the backup of the story itself. If the actors succeed in their work, then obviously the director and crew aspect will recede into the background.
I see excellent close-up work with the actors. I see actors talking to the lens of the camera of the director-cameraman. I hear church bells in Central Park on Sunday morning. I see people stopping to watch the shooting of the film. I see a great theatrical short.
Meta interview with William Greaves. In 1991, more than 2 decades after shooting SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM, Greaves sat down with an audience of filmmakers, critics, scholars, and students to discuss the legacy of his film. What follows are excerpts of his responses to questions posed by the audience.
This is not the way to make a movie. When people in the crew appear on screen and say,
"This is not the way to make a movie. What the hell is this all about?"
the audience begins to relax and say,
That's right.
they find themselves looking for an on-screen clue that articulates what they've been experiencing. The crew says,
This is a piece of shit. He doesn't know what he's doing. I read the script. It doesn't mean anything. It's just bad writing.
and the audience thinks,
Yes, it is bad writing.
of course, the actors will suddenly take hold and sometimes have a moment of truth, which takes what is purportedly bad writing and moves it to another level. The nature of acting is that you can put Shakespeare into the mouth of a horrible actor and it's a disaster. But with a superb actor, Shakespeare takes off. And you can take very neutral dialogue and by varying basic circumstances of that dialogue, entirely change its impact. For example,
Hello, how are you? What's new? Nothing too much. Have you seen so-and-so? No, I haven't.
means almost nothing. But if one person is a killer and the person he's talking to is a potential victim, the same dialogue is entirely different. Suddenly, the person coming away from the piece says,
Geez,
gee, that was well written. It's in the configuration of motivations and basic circumstances that the full reality of the scene emerges.
the issue of sexuality. I was certainly mindful of the fact that sex, love, makes the world go round and makes Hollywood go round. It's the easiest way to capture the attention of the average American audience. Failure to address the issue of sexuality has dire implications in terms of the marketplace.
Homosexuality. For me, the homosexuality was more involved with the simple fact that people change. People become homosexual and people become heterosexual. People have the right to change direction.
6 characters in search of an author. I had thought the crew would challenge me on camera and that this conflict would be central to the drama of the film. My thinking was that if I made the crew sufficiently angry by certain types of redundancies and repetitions, they would begin saying,
"What the hell's going on?
why are you doing this?
What's this all about?"
They'd rebel. But they didn't do that. And it was a source of grief, frustration, and depression for me during the course of shooting.
Similarly, I thought the actors would periodically have trouble with their lines or with me, and that we'd get into debates over the relative merits of this passage or that passage of dialogue, or of this particular psychological adjustment versus that motivation, that kind of thing. But the actors and the crew were so professional that they couldn't cross that boundary. They were too accustomed to situations where the director is God.
Typically, actors are an oppressed community, a desperate community. They have so few opportunities to work that the last thing an actor wants to do is get a reputation for confronting directors. So I didn't get what I wanted, except for that moment near the end where I say, cut, and Pat says,
"This is not working out."
and I say, yes, it is, and she yells,
"It's not." And you know it.
I thought, oh boy, here she comes, because Pat was an intelligent, talented, sensitive actress with a volatile personality. She had radar about when something was truthful and when it wasn't. I figured that once she decided to confront me, she'd pull out all the stops, and I assumed that the crew would catch the whole thing. Of course, by that time, the crew was so pissed off with me that they'd become sloppy in their camera reloading, and wouldn't you know it, just at that moment, they didn't have any film in the fucking camera. I must say, I feel very good about my relationship with the crew. Even when they spoke about me in their meeting, they didn't speak in anger.
They were 6 characters in search of an author. The reality to be observed. But I should tell you some of the other thinking that I had in mind while making SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM. I went to a science high school in New York City and was pointed in the direction of science. I broke off after high school, but I continued to be interested in various scientific theories. The Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, in particular, fascinated me. Heisenberg asserts that we'll never know the basis of the cosmos because that means of perceiving it alters the reality. The electron microscope sends out a beam of electrons that knocks the electrons of the atoms being observed out of their orbits.
I began to think of the movie camera as an analog to the electron microscope. In this case, the reality to be observed is the human soul, the psyche. Of course, as the camera investigates that part of the cosmos, the individual psyches being observed recoil. Behavior becomes structured in a way other than it would have been had it been unperceived. A psychological version of the Heisenberg principle. In this sense, My film was an environment in which the movie camera was set up to catch the process of human response.
I was also interested in the second law of thermodynamics, which describes the distribution of energy in a system. In SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM, the cameras were to track the flow of energy in the system I had devised. If the cameras looked at one person and the level of spontaneous reality began to recede as a result of their being observed, that energy would show up somewhere else, behind the cameras in the crew, for example. The cameras were set up to track the flow of energy from in front of the cameras to behind them and back to the front.
The American body politic. Clearly, we were working in a context of the urban disorders of the 60s and the rage of the African American community against the tyranny and racism of the American body politic.
Plus, there were more specific struggles.
The civil rights marches and the other strategies that were being employed by the African American community.
There was the whole Vietnam problem and the growing dissent over the war.
There was the emerging feminist movement.
And Woodstock.
There was an unhappiness of massive dimensions over the way in which society had been run and about the covert authoritarianism that was evident everywhere. True America was no dictatorship, but there certainly were mores, local and federal laws, social structures in place that inhibited the flowering of the human spirit.
Symbio was an attempt to look at the impulses and inspirations of a group of creative people who, during the making of the film, were being pushed to the wall by the process I, as director, had instigated. The scene I had written was fixed, and I was in charge. I was insisting that this scene be filmed by cast and crew, even though it was making them very unhappy. The question was, when will they revolt?
When would they question the validity, the wisdom of doing the scene in the first place? In this sense, it really was a reflection of the politics of the time.
Audiovisual jazz. The interesting thing to me is that if you take a filmmaker or any artist or writer and you throw them into any milieu, any situation, they probably land feet first if they've had enough experience. If you sit a pianist at a piano, even though that person has no music in front of him, even though he may not decide to play any particular piece, he can still improvise. I use Miles Davis' music in SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM as a metaphor for the film, which is a form of audiovisual jazz. It was improvisational within a certain structure. The film had to be chaos, but chaos of a very special character, intelligible chaos. It had to hold your attention.
The paradox of doing failure. I wanted to harness the paradox of doing failure, of using failure and error and confusion and chaos and unhappiness and conflict. You are drawn inexorably through this cosmic flux. At the end, you say, wait a minute.
What was that about?
And
And why was I so transfixed by it? Well, life is like that. Life keeps you totally absorbed from moment to moment to moment, and yet oftentimes you can't tell what it's about. I like that paradox. My filmmaking always goes for paradoxes, ironies, and contradictions.
It's like Zen. Here we are on this earth, this ball suspended out in space. We're all tied in with the gravitational forces of the sun, and yet we're speeding and trying to go off in another direction.
Cosmically, we're caught in an equilibrium of paradoxical forces.
Welcome, 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 everyone, to the 25th anniversary edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. We'll move from our performance to our roundtable in just a moment.
I
Wanted to formally welcome you from the festival
Oh,
itself. We remind ourselves that we are running this festival as climate catastrophes multiply and intensify. When over 6 million people worldwide have died from COVID, and when the people of Ukraine are fighting for democracy against the brutal invasion and war. For all of us at FLEF, the world is our why. I'm Dr. Andrew Utterson, Associate Professor of Screen Studies here at Ithaca College, and a member of the FLEF programming team. Major sponsors for FLEF include the Park Foundation, Ithaca College, the Park Center for Independent Media, and Cinemapolis. Our festival theme this year is entanglements, a concept that explores how different environments, ideas, imaginaries, places, politics, practices, registers, and species twist into one another and enmesh. We're all very honored that you've joined us today for this very special hybrid event, celebrating filmmaker William Greaves and his landmark film, SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM, Take One. Before we move to our round table, let us have a glimpse of this amazing film itself by way of its trailer.
And then yeah, it's that lane, look. Oh, fire. You want to know? What kind? The feature length, we don't know.
We are not trying to take the film away from Bill Greaves. You know, it's not merely an experiment. It's an experiment that's culminating in a film. Now, I didn't read the concept of it.
Take it. What?
It's doing very well.
It's not you. Look.
The way to make the script better is to first of all drop the euphemisms, talk real language. For all anybody knows, he's directing this whole scene.
He doesn't know how to direct. Ran out of telling you.
Okay, do a big scene.
He wants another magazine. He wants another magazine for Lorna. Get into it, and when we get into it, you know, the people out there will understand.
And if you ask him,
What is the film about? He just gives you some answer that's just vaguer than the question. Don't take me seriously. Blake?
Played it.
So bear with us for a sec.
Yeah, it's that lane, look.
We're just going to invite our wonderful guests to come to the front. And the experiment continues its scene. Grab a seat, fellow panelists. Wonderful to see you. And we have beamed in, I believe, some very special guests too. We'll grab those in a second. I hope everyone can hear one another. We
wow.
have a lot going
Oh, my
on.
goodness.
Oh my gosh. It's
We
so
have
cool.
an extremely special guest. This is really a true privilege to welcome not only Joan Hawkins, film theory scholar, from Indiana University, but Louise Greaves herself, the wife of filmmaker William Greaves and longtime collaborator. Now, I hope that Joan and Louise heard their rapturous round of applause to set the scene a little. We have an in-person audience here in the Roy H. Park School of Communications Park Auditorium, enjoying this event, having a chance to immerse themselves in the films and ideas of William Greaves. And for our participants via Zoom, to give you a sense, there are about 150 people in our audience with us tonight. What I would like to do in a moment is introduce each of our panelists individually and give them some questions. We will also open out for your observations, our audience observations, whether you're in person or on Zoom. By all means, all are welcome to give comments, thoughts, reflections, and specifically questions. Before I do it, it seems appropriate, if I may, and if Louise is hearing us, to invite Louise.
I do hear you. Thank you. Are you proposing that I speak?
Well, if you would you like us to come back to you, Louise, or would you like?
Yes, I think so. I think I would like to get some feedback from the people who are really, I've just jumped into this, and I am frankly so happy that I did. It was a last minute decision, and I am learning so much about my husband's work as I listen to the actors. They really did their homework, and I think they understand very, very deeply what I'm just beginning to grasp at my advanced age. I was in the film, but I hadn't a clue what my husband was up to. I just didn't know. So I'm learning. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will speak later if the opportunity arises.
So it's thrilled to have you with us. And at any point.
Thank you.
More than welcome.
I'm very happy to be here.
Perhaps I can turn in that case for the moment to Joan Hawkins. I will give a formal introduction just for a moment to give some biography and then ask some more informal conversational questions to get us going. Joan Hawkins is professor in the Media School of Indiana University, Bloomington. She's written widely on film, including her monograph, Cutting Edge Art Horror and the Horrific Avant-Garde, and her edited anthology, Downtown Film and TV Culture, 1975 to 2001. And I gather is also working on a new project about the year 1968, in which this very movie was filmed, although finished up in 1971. So let me ask you, Joan, to give some thoughts, but I want to ask you about a description of this film. In your chapter in the new book about William Greaves, you describe this as a lunatic experiment, which address that, a lunatic experiment. So perhaps for those who haven't seen the film, who have just now gotten a sense of William Greaves writing about what he imagined this film would be when he proposed it in 1967 and have seen a trailer. What is this lunatic experiment and how does it fit within Greaves' filmography of this time?
Well, so it's several things. One is that as the actors were reading his words, I mean, he was very clearly trying to set up this petri dish in which, on the one hand, he was making a film that was very self-reflexive and experimental in the film vocabulary of the time. So this idea of film commenting on its own making, film commenting on itself. And so in that sense, it was very much in sort of the tradition of Jean-Luc Godard and John Cassavetes and a number of other people who were working in independent cinema. And that was just, you know, the kind of, that level was just the continual reshooting of this scene of Freddie and Alice with different actors playing the role of Freddie and Alice. The lunacy of it, as it were, came up because he had this deeper ambition, which was to create a situation over which that he would not have any control over in which he hoped the crew would rebel, and that they would then enact a kind of a meta-critique of the film, but that they would also kind of challenge the authoritarian principles around which cinema is organized. And as the cast and crew as the actors were reading, I mean, he was disappointed because they were too well behaved. They just wouldn't do that. And so instead, what they did was they snuck off into this other little room and began filming their critique. And they had this kind of wacky idea that they would give this critique to him and that he would then incorporate it into the film itself, which he in fact ultimately did. But part of the reason it was such a lunatic experiment is that I think people have lost track of how very expensive filming on film was. And so there are times when that's one of the things that's terribly frustrating to the crew. When they are accusing him, not fully realizing how much he was trying to orchestrate this thing. They were accusing him in their little film conversations of wasting film, of not knowing how much film there was. Jack Rosen at one point said, I had to show him that, you put a tape on the roll of film and you say what canister it is and kind of how much film you're using, not realizing that Greaves knew very well. I mean, he knew very well how you took care of canisters of film, and he knew very well how much film cost, and he was very much aware of what he was doing. The lunacy of the experiment was that it might not work out. It might, in fact, be a failure. And how do you orchestrate a failure, and what do you do with it if it truly, truly, truly fails? So I hope that answers your question.
It does, most certainly. We know from our perspective that it was anything but a failure, although it's had an unusual journey. It's legendary how it came to us today and how it dropped out of visibility for a little while, and the whole story, whether apocryphal or not, it seems fitting, of how it ended up at the Cannes Film Festival, but played out of order. Could you tell us a bit about the afterlife, the fact that it was filmed in '68, completed in '71, but then decades of being in the wilderness before finally being rediscovered?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, for me, there are two very sad things about this, is that it was rediscovered, and I know that Patricia Zimmerman has given a very, very humorous account of what happened when it came to the Flaherty seminar, and was shown there, and how people reacted to it. But it also played at Sundance, and I noticed that even in the trailer that you showed, very prominently displayed in the trailer is Steven Soderbergh, who was the darling of independent cinema in 1991, having made Sex, Lies, and Videotape in 1989, which put Sundance on the map. Very prominently displayed is Steven Soderbergh presents William Greaves' Symbiopsychotexiplasm. And I have to say that I first saw the film on, I think it was HBO, it was either HBO or PBS that showed it. And this was after the Sundance screening. And so I saw the first version of Steven Soderbergh Presents, and I had been attracted to the film by this little sort of insert in the TV guide. And the more that I was blown away by the film, but the more that I did research on Greaves, the more I felt really angry and cheated that I came to this wonderful filmmaker who had a long, illustrious career as an actor, as a stage actor, as a cinema actor, as a maker of documentary films, wonderful documentary films, as the producer of a marvelous television program. And I came to him through this one independent film that I happened to see described in the TV guide, and wondered what in the world happened to write him out of film history, as though we don't know. I mean, the way that history is whitewashed is very much a part of the way history is whitewashed. So yes, it had a long, strange trajectory. And then of course, once it showed in both at Sundance and on HBO, it sort of disappeared again for a while until the Criterion Collection released the wonderful DVD that we have of it now. But I know from having tried to teach the film in between the television premiere that I saw and the release of the DVD, it was darn hard to get a hold of. Really hard to get a hold of. You had to find like some little university collection somewhere that would have it and then hope that they would share it with you. And anyway, again, I'm not sure I'm answering your question exactly, but it was a very vexed history. And it is on top of being I guess because I'm working on this book on 68, I would say that on top of being a phenomenal piece of filmmaking and a really phenomenal and insightful analysis and critique of some of the ideas that were kind of prevalent in the art film arena in 68, 69, 70, 71, namely the idea of self-reflexive cinema, the idea of film as art, of pulling attention to how film is made, how it's put together, that it's not a window on the world, that you want in a very kind of Bertolt Brechtian fashion, you want the audience to resist being brought into like a warm bath. You want your film to do something that would spur them to action because there was so much to act about and at and in reaction to in 68 and 69. On top of all of that, I think is incredibly smart and prescient and phenomenally intelligent about the imbrication of racial politics and sexual politics and politics. So this is my own little soapbox that I'm going to get on for a second. But one of the things that I think has been forgotten in thinking about the history of 68, we think about white students being involved in the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and we think about the violence on campus being all about that, about the Vietnam War. And certainly that was a motivating factor, the fact that there was a comprehensive draft. So anybody, any male in the ages of 18 to 21, 25 could be drafted. I mean, with very little advance notice. And so certainly there was this huge reaction to that, but all of the major student strikes on campuses across the United States, the strike at Columbia, the strike at San Francisco State, which was the longest running student strike in the country. It went from November of 68 to March of 69, that strike. It was over inclusion of Black studies in the curriculum. In each case, the inaugurating event that caused the students to go out on strike, even though they were already upset and pissed off about the war, was something that was happening racially. At Columbia, it was because there was going to be a segregated facility that was going to be built on Columbia University campus. At San Francisco State, it was very self-consciously, the white students were working with the Black Student Union to incorporate Black studies on campus. And what people were calling at that time a relevant education. And by relevant education, they didn't mean like job skills. They meant something that decentered white European traditional modes of inquiry. There was this awareness that we've been bamboozled, like Malcolm X said.
Well, thank you so much, Joan. There's a lot there that we can come back to as our conversation continues and as we open up for questions and comment. I did want to transition to Paula, if I may. We'll come back to our actors, give you a moment to recover from your sterling performance. Paula, I'll give again a more formal introduction and then shift into conversation. Paula Ioanide is Professor of Comparative Race and Ethnicity Studies at Ithaca College's Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity. Among other publications, she is the author of the book, The Emotional Politics of Racism, How Feelings Trump Facts in an Era of Color Blindness. Co-editor of the anthology Anti-Racism, Inc., Why the Way We Talk About Racial Justice Matters. So a welcome to Paula. Paula, did you want to pick up on, I wanted to ask you more generally about your responses to the film, but There is a lot there in Joan's introduction too, in terms of the whitewashing of history. And my question, referencing your book, is what would we miss here if we are blind to color in thinking about this film and its moment?
I think it's really amazing that it's April 4th today, which marks the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. And thinking about that year in particular and the backdrop to what Greaves was doing as an experimental kind of meta critique of, I think overall authoritarianism writ large, right? Whether as we internalize it into our family structures, but also as we internalize it in the filmmaking process, right? Just that respect for the director, not breaking one's role in a similar way that one might not do it as a child towards a parental figure, right? But the larger political economic landscape of 68, as Joan Hawkins was speaking, right, is total social unrest. It's urban rebellion in multiple cities across the United States as a result of racial injustice. I suppose much like this generation has been marked by the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But for me, what was so striking about the film is the way that it doesn't sort of self-consciously talk about race, but allows it to play in the dynamics of the relationships of the film itself. And that as the thing that informs how people actually sort of react or don't react to things they say and don't say, right? And one of the most striking parts that for me in the film was when one of the Black film crew members is in that private room making the critique that the director doesn't know what they're doing, right? And the way that for me, what was striking is that the crew wants to return to a clear form of narrative, of concise narrative, of like, we're gonna piece this all together into a nice story, and it's gonna make sense to us and to our audience, right? And in the kind of film production aspect of it, we're not gonna waste money on any more film, right? But that too is a kind of submission to authoritarianism, right? So that too is a kind of submission to what kind of forms are we used to, whether in the classroom setting and the kinds of assignments we have, and the kinds of protests that we have, what are we used to as the neat packaged way of doing things? And Greaves was setting up a structure for us to sort of not just rebel against the authoritarianism of the directorship, right? But also to rebel against the form itself, right? Like, how do we do things? And for me, what's so striking about that in this moment and thinking about the significance of this, of not just him, but his entire kind of archive, is how do we in this moment rethink structures so as not to keep recreating the same racist forms, right? And by that, we might mean how we participate as students, how we participate as teachers, as people who enter any kind of scene. I'll just make last point anecdotally is that for me, I've been teaching one of his films, one of his documentaries on Ida B. Wells, one of the most radical Black journalists in American history, herself completely put aside as a figure until the mid-1980s when she gets kind of re-excavated as an incredible figure for both journalism and for racial justice politics, right? And I've taught this documentary for 14 years without knowing anything about the other works that this Black filmmaker has done. And again, it's about the way we're stripped of the way structured ignorance, right? The way that the absence of these Black key figures in the making of the curriculum, whether it's the film curriculum or the racial justice curriculum, the way that those absences then make us, right, sort of poorly informed to know how to actually create new things. And for me, the biggest gift in the Ida B. Wells documentary, which is a very much more classic documentary film or form, is more about the content of this incredibly rebellious figure and what she can sort of say to us today, right? And I'm both ashamed that I didn't know about his larger archive, and I'm sort of eternally grateful for these kinds of re-excavations of histories. And it's such an honor to be here with you, Ms. Greaves, as kind of like, wow, here's this legacy that goes unseen, but that still has relevance to racial justice politics, to larger questions of current authoritarianism, as well as how those things are internalized in us. I think that's what's so brilliant about kind of what this film represents today. So it's incredible.
And I would just add that I share that shame. I thought I was a film scholar, but I too had not fully known the works of William Greaves, and I'm finding a lot more now. But that shame, or what Joan described as sadness, is worth further scrutiny in terms of how we think about canonicity, how we think about authorship, and how we ascribe greatness or otherwise, and how we frame our histories. Because it is a pleasure in discovery and rediscovery, but it does tell us something, that it is not just a case of a film that was ahead of its time, or the world was not ready for it in that moment, because it's so timely of its moment. It seems to be much, much more than that, with race being a part of that, or a big part of that story. We'll come back to unraveling that. Thank you, Paul. Our leap. Have you recovered from your performance?
Yes.
I want you to more formally introduce Cynthia Henderson, Professor of Acting in Ithaca College's Department of Theatre Arts. She is, as you have now witnessed, a distinguished actor, but also a director, and the author of The Actor's Landscape, and has been honored by New York State with the award of Outstanding Contribution to Social Justice, as well as the distinction of being one of 20 outstanding women you should know. We are getting to know one of those 20 outstanding women tonight. A real pleasure. Cynthia, you have now lived William Greaves's words. You've embodied them so spectacularly. Could I ask, from those words, what has leapt out to you, and then seeing them, the vision from the proposal, then being enacted, and enacted is a very particular word,
Yeah.
because we have the play with acting within the film itself.
Well, there are a lot of things that jump out at me from the script, but I'll get to that in a second. I want to talk about Greaves himself. One of the things, and a lot of it has already been covered, but I'm not a film scholar. I'm theater. And I love the fact that he studied at the Actors Studio, that he studied under Lee Stroudsburg, that he studied with Elia Kazan, and also that there is a parallel to theater in what he was doing with his films. Theater of the oppressed. If we travel to Brazil for a second with Augusto Boal, who in this same time period was responding to political and social injustices in his own country, by developing this process of improvisational theater, kind of played with as if they were games, and infuriating the people who are accustomed to the structure of theater, to the structures that theater are supposed to be. We're supposed to be on stage, audience is in the audience, we present them a story, maybe we'll talk about it afterwards, maybe we won't, but we are storytellers. And this idea of going into this symbiotoxiplasm reminds me of invisible theater, where you go into the spaces. And I actually just did something like this in Brazil with some folks who studied with Boal before he passed away, where you go into these spaces and you are kind of turning social norms on its head in order to see how people would react. I was carrying around this man on my back because one of the things we were doing, we were trying to we were trying to put in their faces that women carry society on their backs. And the guy was basically shuffling and getting things while I'm carrying him around on my back. And people would look at us oddly. Or there was one person, this woman came up and she's brandishing, she's not going to attack him with the knife, but she's brandishing this knife and telling him in Portuguese, get off her back. Women have enough to carry around already, you know, because he wanted to spark this type of outrage. That was what Auguste Boal was doing during this time period. And then juxtaposing what William Greaves was doing with his film work here in the US, with the backdrop of the civil rights movement and the backdrop of the Poor People's March and the backdrop of Dr. King's assassination, all of these things that were happening, the backdrop of the march in the first march in Selma, Bloody Sunday. My mom was there, you know, going marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. All of these things these are all types of invisible theater, types of theater structured to disrupt the social norms, to disrupt, to change public discourse, to change to inspire people to take action. All of these things. So he was taking film and doing what we do with theater when we're doing theater of the oppressed or theater for social change. I actually created a course at this college for that purpose called Theater for Social Change. And we do things to disrupt social norms. So I loved that. And one of my favorite parts was when he was talking about how they had set up the avant-garde film that was going to happen in Central Park. It read to me exactly like we come up with our scenario in Theater for Social Change or Theater of the Oppressed. We come up with the scenario for invisible theater. We go into the space. We have the argument to see who is going to respond, to see how people are going to respond, to see how the crew is going to respond. And when they don't, that's a teaching moment. That they are so entrenched in the hierarchy of how things are supposed to be, that they go to what we would call the confessional in reality TV to unload about what just happened. So all of this, he was a theater maker and a filmmaker. And I thought, you know, it takes quite a brilliant person to take his training in both art forms and use it to disrupt society. Unfortunately, with all the good, you know, all the great things he was doing with his films, we still have some of these problems because people are still so married to the power structure, white privilege. People don't want to release their grasp on their power in order to do what Greaves was encouraging us as a society to do. So that was my take as an actor.
I will turn from one actor to another actor. If I might introduce with great pleasure Marc Gomes, award-winning actor,
Briefly,
writer,
please.
teacher, and since 2018, an assistant professor of theater at Ithaca College. Working across stage and screen, Marc has performed in Canadian theater, the television industry of Los Angeles, and has written, adapted, directed for countless prestigious venues worldwide. And I will throw in just as an aside that in some respects there's a mirroring here because Greaves himself moved to Canada at one point. And in fact, Louise and William.
Yes, yes. So I'll pick up there. First of all, Louise, such a pleasure to meet you in person. I've been watching the documentary that was made to go with the Criterion Collection, and saw you not only in the film, but then as you and Bill continued in your lives and careers to make his films together. Louise is William's collaborator, and they're a mom and pop filmmaking shop that have done it their lives. So
Hardly, but okay.
he has a very good idea what
Yes,
he
she
was doing.
does.
You know, so and I you know, so many things come up. First of all, you know, I'm a member of the diaspora, so I'm Guyanese, and then I'm Canadian, and then I'm American. And so 68 was a huge year globally, not just in America, of course, right? There were the riots in Paris. They were all over the world.
Yeah.
It was a time. It was a time for the world, not just America. As great as the things going on in America were, and I understand how, as young people now, you might find the things we're speaking about as like some ancient history, and I'm sure they are to you, right? It's like and to us, they're so present because we come from a different generation. But the thing I'll touch on that it's really, it's what Cynthia started out with, but this thing of the process and of experimentation, that it seemed to me that Greaves, through his work in documentary and into SYMBIOPSYCHOTAXIPLASM, is interested in the process of what, of how, right? And committed to the process. And I think that comes directly, as Cynthia was pointing out, you know, out of his training as an actor in the actor's studio. And even as he became a documentary filmmaker at the NFB, that training was always there, and he was giving class. That's where he and Louise met, in acting class in Toronto, where I grew up, where I spent my high school years, high school and college years, theater school years, and early part of my career. But so, you know, the Actors Studio and Stanislavski introduces at the turn of the century a process of working for acting that has never been done before. There's not a process. The Actors Studio is an American continuation of that, and Bill inherits that and is committed to it for a lifetime. I'm not sure, Louise, but Louise could probably tell us more about that, but seems to be, and he goes back to it, he teaches it, and it's in his work, and he's committed to this. You know, you hear about it in the Actors Studio, the method, right? Well, nobody knows, very few people know what that actually is. But in fact, it's just a way of working. It is a way of doing. Any way of doing is a method, yeah? He's committed to a method. He's also committed to experimentation, which is at the root of the Actors Studio, at the root of the 40s and 50s of making new form. And again, what you were saying, talking about forms and talking about breaking structures. And you know, you can say on one hand that he's interested in these things politically. He is, but he's an artist and a very particular artist. He's not just a general person. He's not a general Black person or a general Black man. He's a very specific man who had a specific journey, you know, from the high school that he went to, his own interest in science, that then led to an acting career, that then led to a different kind of way of working, of investigation, and then led to making a film in a way that I'm going to set it up. I know what I'm doing, but I have no idea how it's going to turn out. That's the essence of an experiment. Yeah. And that's what you committed to. You committed to the process. What was interesting is that, you know, in fact, the crew did revolt. The actors didn't revolt. He expected the opposite. And then he used what they did. They did revolt. They said everything that he wanted them to say, right? They set up this little cabal and they tore him apart, and expected that this was going to be like their little present they were going to leave at his door, like the cat that brings in the rat that it's just eaten, and built in the way that, you know, as I've learned in the short time, just used it. as you learn at the Actors Studio, you use everything. Everything that comes to you in your work as an actor is grist for the mill. And he was committed to that. That's part of the process. And it can only work if you're committed to the process of the experiment, which is, I want to see when they will break. When will they break? And interestingly, it parallels, as everyone has said, the time and what was happening. The structures, you know, he was not getting up on a soapbox, but he was doing what he did. And the other aspect of this is that he was making a transformational art film. And art films and Blackness don't go together, not anywhere in the world, and certainly not in America. And I think that's one of the reasons we can point to very clearly why the film, we can say, quote unquote, has been lost for so long, and why everybody is struck with this sentence that everybody echoes over and over, the deep sadness they feel that they didn't know about this man when he was hiding in plain sight, is that he was an art filmmaker that and Black doesn't equate. And on top of, and yeah, it just doesn't. And Bill was
for
connected.
dominant white audiences.
Right.
Well, no, but for dominant art making is a dominant white male endeavor.
I'm trying to say that the experimental form in African American artistic traditions is actually way more normative than it is in sort of, you know, European-based forms, right? So even the improvisational or
Right.
the dialogical or the back and forth,
Yes.
Multiple dialogues going on at the same time, all of that has a trajectory that's very well traced in sort of African diasporic traditions. But what doesn't happen is the expectation that it should cross over through a
Right.
Black man into kind of dominant audience.
Or it gets appropriated
Yeah,
by
precisely.
the dominant culture, or the culture who happens to be in power, the white
Right, right.
culture appropriates it,
Mhm.
labels it, stamps it their own, and then in the archives, you find this guy, William Greaves, you know, oh, it seems like he was doing what so-and-so was doing. No, actually, so-and-so was doing what William Greaves was doing.
Which is absolutely true in the documentary form,
Yeah.
right? So we find, what's his name? The very hot, big documentarian in America now.
What's
Tell
his
me.
name?
Ken Burns,
Yes.
who is using, you know, techniques. Oh, these are Ken Burns techniques.
No,
You
they're
go
not.
back to Ali the Fighter, and it was a technique that William, you know, began in making that film, that people, like, he made one of the first documentary films he made where there was no moving film. He was using photographs, but he was pushing in on the photograph. He was making the movement in the camera, which had not been done before. So Ken Burns starts doing it, and people go, oh my God, that's a great way to make documentaries. And Bill Greaves was doing it 15 years earlier.
Exactly.
And he was aware of this context. This is quite a complex film in terms of race, because it's not explicitly
Precisely.
about race, but it's everywhere within the film. And
Exactly.
what I was struck again with in thinking back to his proposal was that he describes inserting his presence as being part of the experiment. He describes himself as, quote unquote, a Negro director, that itself, in that social context, whether it's the US of 1968 or the filmmaking scene of the US of 1968, that itself would be a powerful
Yes.
statement to be seen on film and right throughout this work.
Yeah, to have a Black man leading a crew in Central Park, and a crew that is probably the most multiracial crew that anyone has ever seen. Right, so that's in plain sight as well, that a majority of the crew members are Black. Yeah.
It's a lot like La Mama. It's an avant-garde
Yeah, sure.
theater troupe, and they're the ones who came up with hair. But that's another story you're going into.
Well, I was just going to ask you, you said the actors don't break. Why? Why do the actors go along with this? What is it about the world, the psychology of the actors? Is it because they're so used to displacing their own identity and investing it in others?
I don't know about that. You know, listen, one can make all kinds of assumptions, broader assumptions about actors and acting, but quite frankly, that's not where the experiment is focused. We read a long passage from the piece of the actors, you know, in the book, and what Bill talks about in the documentary is that that was the least of the thing. That was the thing, that was the instrument, that was the way in. That was not what the experiment was about. That was just the way in to actually con everybody to think that this is what it was about. But the thing that he was after was like, let's see what's going to
The
happen
reaction is what it was about.
with these people and how long are they going to go if I play this part really well. And he played that part. Well, he was a master actor as well, all the way. I mean, you can see it as Joan was talking about and you yourself in the things about that the other AD who was challenging him about the lengths of films that he didn't know. And you can see Bill kind of smiling, going, no, yeah, but I do know. And the guy going, no, he doesn't know. And it's like, he does know. He knows. The man's been making documentaries for all his life with his own money. He's very well aware of how many feet of film are being used.
But that's the consciousness of thinking about having a Black director and undermining their
Absolutely.
credibility,
Yep.
their know-how,
Which is what he was doing with
questioning
them.
their
Yep.
qualifications, right? Like all of that was subtextual, I think, in those questions, and that's partially what I think he's experimenting.
Yeah, without having to get into it. And then, in fact, he played the part so well, he would let that person do their thing and allow the audience to just see the very
Yeah.
thing that you just described. Louise, is there something you wanted to add to any of my
I don't know where you came from. You understand my husband in a way that I don't believe, well, except for tonight, anybody has really thoroughly understood. And I'm so moved. I'm almost on the verge of tears, frankly. I don't know where to begin. I would like to add more to what you're saying, but I'm so full and emotionally connected with what you're saying. I just hope this is being recorded. Is it?
Yes.
Oh, I've been thinking of this all throughout. I said, I just hope this is recorded, because I think what you've done here is really appreciate and explain who my husband was and what he was about. He described it in very general terms. He said he was interested in raising consciousness. That's pretty vague. He never said exactly what that was, because I don't think he really wanted to pin it down. But he trusted that he was fascinated by the spontaneous evolution and realization of greater and greater consciousness. I mean, I think he was thinking in evolutionary terms. We're talking about the Big Bang, and here we are, talking about the Big Bang. And so he had a very long range view of not just humanity, and not just the African-American white race thing. He was very conscious of the fact that at one point, colored people were enslaving Black folks. So it's not like it's part of a process of evolving. And he thought his films might, he hoped, become part of this process that was ongoing anyway, with or without him. It was evolving toward greater consciousness, but he figured he'd hop on board and see what he could do. He was really fascinated with creativity, how ideas come to you uninvited. They're there. But he was really an artist. The one thing I really is never mentioned, and it's interesting to me, is that he had a very global view of, well, I guess I've mentioned this already in terms of time, but also in terms of the entire planet. He was very influenced by some thinkers from Brazil, for instance, also from India and Africa. And so he looked at the big picture, you know, he saw it all as a unit that was interacting and that was evolving. But I'm just so very happy that I have the privilege of being here tonight. Thank you so much for doing this at Ithaca. And Joan, I'm really looking forward to this book of yours. I would love to get in touch with all of you guys. The readings were wonderful. You really did your homework. I had forgotten half of this stuff. It just, whoa, came to life. Thank you so very, very much.
We do have a few minutes left. This has been
Probably take a minute to plug Scott MacDonald's and Jacqueline Stewart's
That's-
wonderful collection of essays. I have an essay.
Yes, you do.
An essay, a lot of wonderful scholars. And this is just a great book on William Greaves that covers a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, and was so indebted to you making those archives so generously, making those archives available.
I'm still working on it. At it. I don't know if you noticed the boxes in the back of me. I'm buried in boxes and papers, but keeps me alive.
Yeah.
It keeps me occupied, and I'm growing as a result of what I'm picking up through my husband really appreciated the fact that it wasn't just his films.
Yeah.
It was the work involved in making the film that he thought was. He said, well, I'm filming, I'm recording this wonderful brain, and I'm only going to use 1 minute of it in this film, right? So he saved as much as he could. It wasn't always easy to do. And it cost a pretty penny for storage costs. But there's a lot of material that has been saved as a result of his archival brain. He was thinking long range. So someday this could be really important. It's also very aware of the fact that there were not that much African American archival materials left. And he said, I'm not going to throw mine out. So somebody someday is going to look at this, maybe. We don't know. We hope. So he was hopeful. Thank you so much for all of this wonderful, wonderful evening. It's very, I think Bill is, an appreciation of who he is, who he was, is growing. I'm trying to catch up. I'm just trying to catch up. Thank you so very much.
We have a few minutes for any questions. If you're joining us on Zoom, by all means, please do raise your electronic hand and we will look out for you and invite you to the screen. If you are in our in-person audience.
Yes, lovely. I don't know how to use this system, so I'm stuck with certain images. But I would love, there we go. Thank you.
I see some waving, but do we have questions? And do we have any from our Zoom participants? And I will just let you know that you will not be mic'd. So in this auditorium, I will relay your question. I have one from the front and then we'll come to the back. It's a wonderful question. The question, just to relay to our Zoom audience, is about the film within the film, Over the Cliff, I think is the
Yes.
stagey title for
Yes,
it. So
yes.
how does this relate to the bigger picture? Or is it just, as I think Mark has suggested,
The MacGuffin.
Catalyst.
a MacGuffin? That's a good way of
Yeah.
putting it. A catalyst, that is also a wonderful way of putting it. A device, a way
Yes.
to elicit these various provocative responses from all of us, including the spectator. What do others think? Does it have some particular meaning in terms of its content, or is it simply meant to be stagey, dramatic material that will be manipulated in certain ways?
Joan, what do you think?
Joe?
Well, in my essay, I talked about the fact that I thought it did have a great deal of significance, and in part just because it became part and parcel of a whole interrogation of heterosexual marriage that was going on at the time. If you think about like the novels of Updike, Norman Mailer, films by John Cassavetes, that were always sort of revolving around this, the kind of impossibility of men and women living together. And within the film that the crew is making in their little room where they're critiquing Greaves, one of the really telling, well, there are two very telling lines, but one of the moments when they're picking apart this scene where Alice continues to accuse Freddie of being a faggot, and that's the term she's using. And one of the crew members says, every woman says this to every man at some point in their relationship. And then goes on to talk about how women are trained to be what he calls ball breakers. And that there's a way in which that scene is being written and played and replayed in all these different ways that keeps bringing us back again to like this particular moment where, again, one of the crew says, you know, it's like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but not as well written. And so it takes us back to this thing that was very much in the zeitgeist of the time. And it seems like then that becomes a catapult for talking about these larger issues, namely how race and gender and sexuality, racial politics, gender politics and sexual politics all become very imbricated this time.
I saw a hand right at the back, if there aren't other comments on this question. The question from the back, if you shout it forward and we'll relay it to our guests.
Maybe Louise could answer that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there was a question.
I didn't hear the question though.
Question was about the funding for this film. And
Oh, yes, a very interesting question. It actually came from one of Bill's actors from Montreal, who just hit it lucky, or maybe he was a brilliant businessman, but he invested in the shopping malls, which were just developing at the time. And he was so impressed with Bill's work as a teacher that he said, Bill, you know, you should be making a feature film. I've got the money. And Bill says, well, okay, sure. But he said, well, what kind of feature do you think I should be making? Something to that effect. He said, doesn't matter. Anything you think of is fine. I don't have no strings attached. Just go for it. So that was a wonderful opportunity that very few people have to just do what they want to do. And he just threw this together. You know, it was something that was inside him, and he didn't have to think about it. These were the questions that preoccupied him, and he thought, I can explore it on film. He really thought he could capture this moment of creativity, you know, that was totally unexpected, and it came from God knows where. And he was very sad at the end because he thought he had missed the boat, and he hadn't proven his theory. But he didn't discount it, and he was determined he was going to find it in the editing room. But then he had this wonderful gift from his crew that solved that problem.
And I had read that he had wished he was filming himself at the moment that he discovered the footage of the crew critiquing his work, which would have added another layer of this reality.
Yeah.
Is it true, Louise, the story is so fascinating in itself, whether true or not, it seems to fit the legend, but is it true that Bill took the film himself to Cannes, to the film?
Oh, that's it's not quite that simple. He did take the film to Paris, and he spoke with, what's it, Louis, I forgot the name of the person who's the Cahiers, whatever it is. Or, what is it? What's the name?
Cahiers du cinéma.
Oui. and he saw the film in a theater, and they had dinner later the next day or maybe whatever. And he said, I couldn't make any sense of this film. Well, Bill didn't realize at the time, only when he got back home and he looked at the reels, that they had been badly numbered. So it's not surprising he couldn't make any sense, but at that time, maybe, Macquarie, is that the name I'm thinking? Anyway, Bill said, you know, that's the way it is. He did try. He was friendly with I'm so bad. This is what happens. You get to be my age. Names, but a big movie star anyway. And he said, you know, the problem with your film, Bill, is that you're not so-and-so big, you know, Robert Redford or whoever was big at the time. He said, 20 years, give it 20 years. He was right about that. Anyway, it's interesting that it's being discovered, really discovered and appreciated today.
And how did Bill, in retrospect, think of this film? Because he made so many wonderful films and so different from one another.
Yes. He didn't, that's a very interesting perception. He didn't have a style, which would have maybe made it easier for film critics to pigeonhole him. He just, you know, the material told him what it should be. It wasn't that he was imposing. And not only that, he didn't really always have a choice of what he was going to be working with. I mean, it was who happened to have some money who was coming to him and wanted a film. He did a lot of sponsored film. So he had to be very flexible about what style, you know, and what he actually was able to capture on film, how that could be presented in a way that made sense. And that, so it was a challenge on a lot of levels. It's not like he had the opportunity to go, this was the only film that he personally had a chance to design, to conceive of. Everything else was brought to him. And then he had the problem of trying to make what may have been really very routine, boring educational stuff into something that had some meaning and that would have a drama and that would change people as they watch it. And usually the sponsors say, oh, how interesting. You know, I hadn't thought of that. So, oh, well, sure, let's go for it. Not always, but usually that was the way it worked out. He saw it in sight. In whatever it was, he could get to the bottom of it. You know, what is this really, really about? And how can it be presented in a way that will change people who watch it? If it didn't do that, it was not worth bothering with. And so he had to convince the sponsors that they had something really interesting here that they didn't know about. They may not have realized it was for them, it was just information. But for him, it was, how can this information be used? And how can it empower people and change them the way they think? And ultimately, he felt that it's only a change in consciousness that is going to solve our human problems. He wasn't out there with a placard, you know, waving, you know, shoot him up, shoot him up. No, he thought he was more valuable alive than dead, I think. I mean, he was fascinated with life and humanity and consciousness.
Empowerment, change, life, consciousness.
Yes, 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 yes. And he saw film as a solution. At the time, he could see that he could reach a lot of people through film. And Hollywood was closed, so, you know, where do you go? Where do you go? He really felt that he had learned so much from the National Film Board, even though they were doing very routine stuff. But he became the chief editor of their award-winning unit, Unit B. So he was fascinated by sound editing and also image. A change of one frame could do to totally transform a scene. He was fascinated by that kind of thing. He said when he would look at a film that was unedited, he would let the film talk to him, tell him what it could do. He didn't come to it with preconceived ideas. So that's a hard way to go because it costs money if you're sitting and watching this film. You can't be checking the clock. But that's.
Louise, for being with us and for giving us this it is truly a rare privilege to have this insight into William Greaves's work and her collaboration with this film. Has really touched us as an audience, Louise, and on behalf of all of us at Ithaca College, the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, I'll ask you in a second to thank Louise, but also Joan and Cynthia and Paula and Marc.
Yes.
I'll ask you to seek out the new book on William Greaves, edited by Scott MacDonald. Jacqueline Stewart has Louise interviewed in it. It has Joan's chapter within it and tons of fascinating details about this film and others. And if you'd like to see it again, or if you've yet to see it, if you're not an Ithaca College student, it is available through Cinemapolis, through the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival's virtual cinema platform for this week only, but see it beyond as well. I'll ask you to put your hands together for all of our guests.
Oh. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. Oh.
It was lovely.
That was wonderful. It's so great. Great.
Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. This
Thank
is
you so
great.
much.
Yes, this was wonderful. Thank you very much. Joan, I want to get in touch